Again, and good morning, everyone. In the room, we have a great audience, and on Zoom. Uh, our speaker today is Mallory O'Connor, a multi-talented woman. She's a writer, an art historian, a musician, and a chef extraordinaire. She holds degrees in art history, and American history from Ohio University, although she hails from the Sacramento area. For 20 years, she's taught art history at the University of Florida and Santa Fe College. And during this time, she also wrote hundreds of magazine articles and critical essays. I've read a number of her books, both nonfiction and fiction, and she's lately expanded into what you could almost call art sci-fi. In any case, today we're talking about her latest book, which she co-wrote with her talented husband, John, who sends apologies. He had a COVID shot and he's down under. In any case, Mallory will tell us about art and food. And over the years, you may have heard, as I have, that the visual presentation of a plate, of a meal, is at least as important as the taste. That might be debatable, but many chefs go to great efforts to make an artistic presentation. The visual parts of our brain are stimulated by that presentation. And human brains are very visual centered, as, for example, dogs are smell oriented. So that first impression when you see the plate is impactful, and it establishes, you might say, a milieu for the then wonderful taste of the food. So one has to wonder, what is the impact of having a room full of TV screens while you're eating? At any rate, I'm very pleased to invite Mallory to the podium to tell us about art and food.
Thank you, Phyllis, very much, and thank you all for coming out today to hear what I have to say about The Kitchen and the Studio, a memoir of food and art. And yes, as she told you, my husband sends his apologies. We got our COVID boosters on Thursday, and since then, he's essentially had the flu. So he said, I don't think I'd better try to go today. He's kind of like this. He's up to petting our cat, that's about it. I also had a good friend of mine, Gwen Thompson, who is my official caterer for cookbook events. And so she has made some lavender cookies and some scones that are back on the table with the coffee if you haven't found them already. And those are recipes from the cookbook. And so if you haven't tried them yet, give them a little shot and see what you think. We also do have the cookbook available both in hardcover and softcover if, after hearing my presentation, you are compelled to buy one of the cookbooks, or you can order it on Amazon. But in any event, I'm going to talk to you about the connection between food and art, because our cookbook, we decided, should also be an art book. So it is a cookbook, it is an art book, it is a memoir, and it's a love story about our 60-year togetherness, my husband and I, that started with our love of food, at least in part. And I'll get to that story in a minute. Okay, so let's see what the best way to do this is. Yeah. Okay. Oh, yeah. Okay. I need some light. Should have brought my glasses with the little spotlights on them. Yeah. Ah. Okay. That's better. Actually, the book really was our COVID project. When 3 years ago, I guess it was three now, yeah, when we got locked down and sort of self-quarantined and couldn't entertain and, had to sort of spend this time in seclusion, we said, oh, look, now we have time to work on this project that we've been wanting to do for some time and never had time to do. So we were able then to go back and take a look at our notes and the ideas that we had to put this together, because this book actually is based on the cooking journals that I have kept since 1962, when John and I first met at the University of California at Davis. And I began writing. I'd always kind of kept little diaries, but this journal was different because I began keeping track of all of the special occasions that we had: birthdays, anniversaries, fun dinner parties, holidays, times with families and friends where we cooked something special. And I say we because we've always split the kitchen duties, and both of us enjoy cooking. And so I decided to put this all down and keep track of it. So my cooking journal goes back to 1962. And we used it as the template for the cookbook, because it reminded us of all those good times and the fun that we'd had. And then I put down the menu and kept track of some of the recipes in actually what was my mother's recipe book that she handed off to me when I got married. And it had all kinds of wonderful recipes. My mother was, I would call her a culinary explorer. She had lived in 17 different states and the Panama Canal Zone. And everywhere she went, she collected recipes and tried the local foods. So when I was growing up, I'd come home for dinner and I never knew what to expect, because it might be black-eyed peas and cornbread, or it might be Boston baked beans, or it might be chicken teriyaki, or something else that was exotic. So I just learned to appreciate and love any kind of food that was nicely cooked and nicely presented. And the first time I got little chores that my mother handed off to me. She let me start helping to do this and that and the other thing, chop the vegetables and get things ready. But I was taking French lessons from a lady down the street, and I was about 12. And I asked Miss Rene, did she have a special recipe? I wanted to cook something really nice for my parents and surprise them. And she said, well, mon enfant, if you really want to do something special, I have a recipe for bœuf bourguignon. And so I said, oh, goody. And she gave me this long recipe, which I diligently followed and managed to present my parents with a Sunday dinner of bœuf bourguignon. So that was my first real foray into chefing. And I had a wonderful time, and they loved it. And I said, well, this obviously has some potential. So sort of took it from there. And the recipe for bœuf bourguignon that she gave me is, ta-da, in the cookbook. So that's one of the recipes, along with a lot of others that I got from a whole batch of different sources. Well, as I mentioned, John and I met at University of California, Davis in 1962, and we were married in January 1963, so that didn't take too long. From the beginning, we really shared a passion for good food and wine, and that's continued throughout our collaboration. So the book is very much bound up with our lives in that respect. We decided that maybe this fascination with cooking and food and wine might be genetic, because since my mother was really a wonderful cook, and my grandmother had been a pastry chef at a hotel in Chicago, and then also had started her own catering business at a time when women didn't usually, take on an entrepreneurial activity like that. And John's father was a chef who had owned several restaurants and later had a sort of specialty grocery store in Sacramento. So we said, oh, well, clearly, it's got to be in our genes. So as I mentioned, John was my art teacher when I went to Davis. I was a freshman art student, and the first class that I took was a drawing class with Wayne Tebow, and Wayne's graduate assistant was John O'Connor. So we got acquainted and we started talking, and we haven't stopped. So we just really, we were very professional though. We didn't actually go out on a date until after the end of the semester. So nobody could say, oh, you're just doing this to get a good grade. Well, I got an A anyway, but but the first date that we had, he asked me over for dinner to his house that he had in Davis, and he cooked dinner for me. And I said, oh boy, is this a keeper or what? So he cooked a beautiful crab louis. I don't know if you cook a crab louis, but he assembled a crab louis. And he also had Japanese specialties. He knew I was crazy about all things Japanese. So he had his roommate, David Morris, who was an actor, go over to Sacramento and pick up sushi and delicacies and so on. So I was thrilled and even more delighted that I had come into the orbit of one Mr. John O'Connor. Maybe I should, oh, and that incidentally is John's illustration of the crab louis that we decided to use as the cover for the cookbook. Now, which way do I? This way. Ah, there we are. Okay, so we hadn't counted on John getting a job. He hadn't even finished his degree yet. But then he got this call from University of California at Santa Barbara, and they said, would you like to come and be the sabbatical replacement for one of our professors who's off to Tasmania? And John said, sure. So that was a semester before he was actually going to get his MFA. And we decided, we kind of looked at this situation. I'd moved in with John, in the meantime. I mean, it was the 60s, right? So we were very au courant. And so we decided that maybe the university officials would frown on a student living with one of the professors. So we said, you know what, maybe we ought to get married. I thought, okay, that's a good idea. So I called my mom and I said, hey, Mom, John and I want to get married next Friday. And she was like, what? No engagement announcement, none of the priorities and things you're supposed to do. And she said, well, how can we do this? I mean, you want to have a church wedding, right? And a dress and all of that. And I said, nah. I'm going to go to Santa Barbara with John. And she said, well, what about a honeymoon? I said, Mom, Santa Barbara. You can't do better than that for a honeymoon. So she called various relatives who were in the area. And then we went out and bought a little white dress. And so we got married, and Mom baked a cake. And off we went to Santa Barbara. Actually, we were married on Friday. And let's see if I have another picture of this. Oh, yes. John had shown me this picture that he had painted in 1961. Now, who on earth paints a portrait of their stove? You know, give me a break. This guy was serious about the food thing. Okay, so off we went to Santa Barbara. But first we went, on Friday we were married. On Saturday, we drove down to Menlo Park in the Bay Area. And on Saturday afternoon, the fellow who had been John's best man, Mike Fong, John was best man for Mike and Chris Fong's wedding. So we had back-to-back weddings. And then Sunday, we drove to Santa Barbara, and Monday, John started teaching. So it was a little bit of a whirlwind, but wonderful. Not long after we were married, he took me to meet two friends of his, people that he'd known for quite a while, William Theo Brown and his partner, Paul Warner. Both of them wonderful artists, and they had a beautiful home in Malibu overlooking the Pacific. And so they invited us to have lunch. And I had met them briefly at Davis because Bill had taught for a while at Davis before they moved down south. And so we went to their place. We enjoyed the beautiful surroundings, beautiful house. I don't know, somehow they just did everything right. It was just absolutely gorgeous. Everywhere you looked, there was a little still life or some object or some little painting or, you know, something that made it just special and unique and beautiful. And so we had lunch on the terrace overlooking the ocean. And Paul did a beautiful omelet, and then with fresh greens from his garden. And we enjoyed it so much, a good glass of Chardonnay. And so at the time, I was taking art classes at Santa Barbara, but I also was studying art history, and I didn't really know which way I wanted to go. You know, should I go for the studio degree, or should I stick with academics, or, you know, which direction should I go? So I asked Bill what he thought, you know, what would he recommend? And he knew me well enough to know that I was, you know, really interested in art, and I was pretty good at it. And, you know, so I thought he might be a good person to get some information from. And we talked a little bit about it, and he said, well, what I would tell you is that you should live the artist's life. I was like, what's that? What do I do to live the artist's life? And I thought about it a lot after that. And I thought, well, you don't have to live in a garret, you know, or drink yourself to death or cut off your ear. You know, those things are all optional. But what you do is that you look at your life and you make that an art form. So make your life art. And that's been kind of a sort of a motto for us for a long time. Live the artist's life. This is a painting that John did called Mallory at Malibu. And we went down, we were fairly frequent visitors after that at Bill and Paul's, and go enjoy the ocean and have a great time. Well, speaking of the artist's life, it's amazing to find out how many artists love to eat. There does seem to be some kind of interesting connection between food and art. And I started looking at it, as an art historian might, and found out that art has a long and delicious history. So if you look at cave paintings, for example, like this one, from thousands of years ago, what was the frequent subject of the artist's work? Their food. They didn't paint pictures of deer and bison because they thought they were cute. They were food. They were absolutely essential to survival. And so they made an art form out of this. And from that early time, I think the connection between food and art was really established. Food images capture, the kind of the connection between life and art and food and surviving and doing it in a beautiful way. So there was sort of let's take a gourmand stroll through that history. Okay, Mallory, press the right button. What am I doing wrong?
The one that's blank now, it's worn off.
Oh, great. That's why I can't see it. Okay. The festive consumption of food and drink was an important social ritual, for example, in the Roman world. And this fresco from Herculaneum shows a couple enjoying themselves Roman style. Roman literary sources describe elite private banquets as a kind of feast for the senses, not just the food, but everything. Dining was an opportunity for the host to share their feeling for food and for art, to impress his guests with extravagant fare and luxurious tableware and diverse forms of entertainment. And so you can see this Roman couple enjoying themselves. For our cookbook, John decided to create 107 original pastel paintings to illustrate the recipes rather than taking photographs, which is what most cookbooks have. So he really took him over a year to produce the illustrations for the book. And they were produced, he was going to tell you all about how he did them, but I'll just kind of summarize for you. He would use Photoshop to sort of create the basic idea and put in different photographs that he had or that we found or whatever of the food. And then he would manipulate that and create an image. And then he would print that image at 50%. And then he would use pastels to complete the image. So he had this kind of prototype image to work from. And then he would embellish it and change it and modify it and so on and so forth. So this is his illustration for Coeur à la crème, which is a wonderful French dessert. And there, I must say, there's, if the cookbook leans any direction in particular, it's maybe a little toward France, because there are quite a number of French cookbooks, and I was a real Francophile and took French lessons and loved my French and read lots of French authors and so on. So I got to confess I love French food and French cooking. So Coeur à la crème here is a wonderful Valentine's Day treat, because what you have is this wonderful creamy, delicious vanilla custard that you can shape into, for example, a heart, and then cover it with a fresh raspberry sauce and maybe a little glass of port to go with it. And oh, yum. So this is actually on, he decided to put the Coeur à la crème on one of our favorite tablecloths, which was a tablecloth that we got in Provence on one of our visits to France. So it all kind of came together there. References to the relationship between culinary and artistic practices document the culinary interests of great masters such as Leonardo da Vinci, and who, according to some of the things I've read, was a darn good cook. and very, very interested in food himself. When courting royalty and religious patrons at their castles and affairs, Da Vinci would often dine on green salads and fish and fruit and vegetables, bread and mushrooms and pasta. He loved garbanzo bean soup, which he called minestra. And it was also said that he was an excellent cook and enjoyed entertaining friends and patrons in his own dining room. So even in his religious paintings, such as The Last Supper, Da Vinci pays careful attention to what was being served and to the table setting. And you see all of the things that he includes, bread and, the wine, of course, but other kinds of embellishments in terms of the way he sets up the table. And I do want to show you, up large and beautiful, that crab salad, crab Louis, that John prepared for me for our first date. And here is his pastel portrait of the crab Louis. Few artists have painted portraits so beguiling as Giuseppe Archimbolo, an Italian painter of the late Renaissance, who made a name for himself in the courts of the Holy Roman Empire by creating painstakingly detailed images of various sitters. And in place of the detailed facial features one typically expects in a portrait, there is an arrangement of fruits and vegetables, plants and animals, and other elements. Both psychologically acute and scientifically accurate, Archimbolo's portraits were celebrated by his patrons and contemporaries as expanding traditional notions about what portraiture could be. Yes, this doesn't necessarily appeal to everybody, but it was different. It got him quite a lot of attention.
Mute my audio, but I'm not getting any audio.
There's no sound.
No.
When Phyllis comes home today, because we can watch it again, Roger, it's recorded. Perhaps she could bring it up for us.
Yeah.
Okay. Get a nice long time to look at Archimbolo. Good grief. What would we do to identify all these things? I'm seeing mushrooms and carrots, cabbages, squash. Yikes. Corn. What else can we find? Pears. All right. Ooh. I'm not sure about this. Starfruit. Who knows? Are we back on? Okay. Well, John also manages to create beautiful portraits from humble subjects. Who would have thought a plate of sliced oranges could look quite so tempting? In the 17th century, Dutch artists became famous for their intricate still lifes of food and flowers. Here's a painting by Clara Peters, the first lady of the Dutch still life. It's not known when or where exactly she was born, nor when and where she died. This was not unusual when it came to women in general in the 17th century because they were not taken very seriously as artists. Their main purpose was to become good wives and mothers. She was most likely the daughter of a painter, and that's where she probably got her education, and was required to be, not required to be included in the apprenticeship records. Some even suggest that Jan Bruegel, the elder, was possibly either her relative or her teacher. Nevertheless, we know from her work that she was active between 1607 and 1621. And her style is lifelike, very realistic, The objects appear casually laid on a table, sometimes in apparently random order, and detailed. The painter has provided a very clear and frontal view of all that's displayed. She specialized in still life compositions with a variety of objects. Some are natural objects like fruit and flowers. Other times she added plates, goblets, precious metals, ceramic bowls, cheese, pies, fish, together with other common or more exotic foods that you can find present in her work. Aha. The same might be said of this pastel painting that John did of our table at our first dinner party after we'd gotten married and moved to Santa Barbara. We had rented a small but charming brown shingled craftsman cottage on Prospect Avenue. It had leaded windows and glass cabinets, plank floors, and a window seat. If I stood on the window seat and looked out, I could see the ocean in the distance. And the screen porch was covered with wisteria. It was very romantic. We decided to invite the chair of the department over for dinner and plied him with a menu of our personal favorites that included John's special guacamole and my boeuf bourguignon with braised red cabbage. And we introduced the good doctor, Dr. Alfred Moyer, to several of our favorite wines. When he finally left around midnight, we were all in a very jovial frame of mind. And here John captures the ambience of that evening and also provides a glimpse of the surroundings with special attention to light and shadow and the leaded windows that we had in the cottage. Alfred Moyer was quite the bon vivant and had quite the reputation for his dinner parties and so on and so forth. So we should have been, really nervous about having someone over for dinner who had his degrees from Harvard and had written the definitive book on Caravaggio and was chairman of the department and was running around in circles which in Santa Barbara included the Hollywood elite as well as the people in Montecito. But heck, we just said, hey, we're going to do dinner. And sure, Alfred's going to enjoy this because if he likes good food, we'll see if he's really up to the challenge. So we were audacious little rascals, I must say. So here's our beef bourguignon. And I always like to serve it not exactly in the traditional fashion. I like braised red cabbage with it because it always seemed like the tartness of the cabbage, sort of sweet vinegar, sweet sour flavor offset the very mellow richness of the beef bourguignon. So it was a kind of fun combination to play with. The National Gallery in Washington, D.C. has more than 600 artworks that contain food, including this delightful depiction of a luncheon party by the French artist Claude Monet. Monet loved to entertain at his lovely home in Giverny outside Paris. He was an excellent chef, and his food journal has been published as a cookbook titled Monet's Table that was really kind of an inspiration for our cookbook. So, if you have Monet's Table or you've seen it, that's sort of what we had in mind. The luncheon, painted in 1868, captures a convivial, relaxed, and carefree scene. His first wife, Camille, is at the table with their young son. It's an autobiographical painting that conveys Monet's appreciation of some of those finer things that make life so worthwhile. More controversial was Monet's famous painting of a picnic titled Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, which shows two elegantly clad gentlemen lounging on a blanket accompanied by two women, one of whom is naked. The public was shocked, not only by the scene, but also by the fact that the naked lady is looking right at the viewer with placid disinterest. Has she no shame? In April of 1976, John and I joined our friends Nate Shiner and Donna Hasbrook for a picnic at Noonan's Lake for our own version of Le Déjeuner. Nate was on the art faculty at the University of Florida. He had just come from California, where he'd been on the faculty at Sacramento State College. And he immediately bonded with us over food as much as art and lifestyle and so on. So here we have John on the right, along with me, dressed as an Indian princess. That would be so politically incorrect these days. But, and Nate and then Chris, our son, lounging, but with his clothes all on the picnic table. And Donna Hasbrook took the photo. We were actually doing, we were out at Noonan's Lake doing a photo shoot for an advertisement for a show that Nate and John and I had at the Crimping Parlor in downtown Gainesville, a beauty shop that was run by a very interesting character. So we called the show the Californians Show in Florida. So the Californians Show Florida. And for this, John and Nate dressed up as kind of Western gamblers, and I dressed up as an Indian, and Donna took pictures of us with my horse, Othello. I had a beautiful black Morgan horse at the time, so it all fit right in. And one of our picnic desserts that day was this luscious white cake with caramel frosting that John depicts here. You might recognize this, The Potato Eaters, an oil painting by Vincent van Gogh, painted in April of 1885 in the Netherlands. It's now in the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. The Potato Eaters is considered by many to be one of Van Gogh's first great works of art. At the time of its creation, he was only recently started painting, and many of his early works focus on the simple life of peasants and workers that he encountered. And here he shows a family gathered around their humble meal of potatoes. Although the surroundings are far from luxurious, the mood is one of solemn celebration and enjoyment. And here's John's painting of oven potatoes with rosemary, another simple side dish that is richly delectable. In the 1860s, the Victoria and Albert Museum in London opened its 3 refreshment rooms, the world's first museum restaurant. Since then, food and cookery have been featured in museums in a number of different ways, in food, in anthropology, science museums, or those that are dedicated to key figures in the history of cookery. One of them is the Museum of Culinary Art at the childhood home of Auguste Escoffier, the founder of haute cuisine, according to some, and the father of modern cookery. Today, there's an ever-growing number of artistic spaces and extremely high-quality culinary offerings. Here's the Bilbao Guggenheim Museum, a groundbreaking project and a prime example of the kind of connection between cooking and artistry. This is the interior. Since it opened in 1997, it has interpreted gastronomy as an expression of cultural identity and hospitality, a sign of quality and creative expression, and an intrinsic part of the museum's central vision. In his autobiography, The Secret Life of Salvador Dali, the artist says, "At the age of 6, I wanted to be a chef." Playing, composing, drawing pictures with words, all of these things can describe multiple realities. It all depends on what lens you're looking through. Dali's cookbook, Le Dîner de Gala, is one of the number of cookbooks to make their way out of artists' studios and kitchens. I guess you could say that John's book took a few surrealistic liberties with his images, like this one of country-style green beans being watched over by a white rabbit. Curiouser and curiouser. Eating and creating are needs, human impulses that have always existed everywhere. For a long time, the first of these was considered to be something fundamental, a vital function. And this changed significantly with the introduction of creativity and research into a number of culinary practices as art became more intertwined with social commentary. This is a work called Supper Time by Horace Pippin from 1940. Body of work that Pippin developed goes beyond basic scenes of everyday life that typically come to mind when you consider folk art. These are vehicles for interpreting important episodes of American history and grappling with what society might be. Giving Thanks and Supper Time, which hang in the Barnes Foundation alongside post-impressionist still lifes and other European masterpieces, convey the unique importance of the kitchen and table in African American culture and in the American imagination. These are spaces for reflecting on your day, passing down family history, recipes, and traditions, discussing the serious issues and observing daily religious rituals. But please, have a bite while you're at it. And speaking of rituals, my mother absolutely loved all things English. So it's not too surprising that she loved English tea parties. When she and I traveled, which was pretty often, we found ourselves often in locations, Vancouver, Ottawa, London, Bath, Cardiff, to name a few, where we could take advantage of that lovely English tradition of taking tea. So for a special surprise party, I invited a dozen of Mom's Gainesville friends to take tea with us. Even though it was December, it was warm enough to use the screen porch and the deck. That's the Florida advantage. The scones that I mentioned that are there on our table as an offering of some of the recipes in the book are the scones that I made for that tea party occasion. And John enhanced the tradition by creating this pastel of one of the tea time treats, another of the tea time treats, apricot balls, served very properly with Mom's treasured Spode china. Few cultural products express beliefs and values with the same power as food. In art, food helps convey status. Certain dishes and ingredients are connected to royalty, while others rely on the everyday populace. Through narrative and still life, and from old world classics to pop art, food roots an image in time and place. Inspired by rapid modernization, especially in the 1970s onward, artists like Andy Warhol responded to the changing landscape with new contemporary ideas about food, and pop art was born. Fast became a word associated with food, which hadn't always been the case before. On the other hand, John's opulent pastel of chocolate cherry trifle conveys the elite decadence that makes one's mouth water with envy. Though he's often classified as a pop artist, it would be more accurate to call American painter Wayne Thiebaud a godfather to the genre, since much of his work that could be categorized as pop art came before that movement was firmly established. But even a brief glimpse of Thiebaud's output makes it easy to understand why he's often considered along with the likes of Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg. In fact, it was while spending some time in New York and being exposed to the work of those artists that Thiebaud began recreating shape-based food displays. Thibault received his art training at trade school, which helps explain the practicality of his pieces. In the early 1960s, he released a series of colorful paintings of sweets with titles like Pies, Pies, Pies. In his 1964 painting, Lemon Meringue Pie, Thibault really is a master of paying attention to the beauty that exists in the everyday. I had known Wayne Thibault even before I went to Davis, where I took art classes with him, because I had taken art classes earlier on at the Crocker Art Museum in Sacramento, and his first wife, Patty Thibault, was the instructor in those classes. So I had had a chance to meet Wayne, and John and I were good friends of his, and even after we were married, Wayne and his second wife, Betty Jean, came to Santa Barbara to visit us. And so I thought, okay, what am I going to do? I always loved to tease Wayne. He was infinitely teasable. And so I decided, okay, we've got to have a pie. And I had seen his painting, this one, of lemon meringue pie. And so I tried to recreate it and even found a similar kind of plate to serve it on, just so I could say, do you recognize this, Wayne? I called him Uncle Wayne anyway. So this was, I can't say that, I really inspired him, but he painted another lemon meringue pie right after he had seen us in Santa Barbara. Okay, well, this is where John would have taken over and talked about how he produced the art. So I'm going to just quickly go through the few notes that he had, because he had longer explanations for everything. But the art begun in April 2020 and completed in March 2022. 107 pastels of the food described in the kitchen and the studio. Here is Roquefort loaf. And he wanted me to remind you that pastel is one of the earliest painting mediums. You could even say, essentially, that some of the cave art done in sort of chalky substances and so on is a precursor to contemporary pastels. He uses something called pan pastel and Stabilo Carbothello pastel pencils and Strathmore archival charcoal paper, which formed the basis for these artworks. Here is lamb stew. And my mother's oyster soup. And here is John's gazpacho, a special recipe that he has developed over the years. And this was a painting of his of that. Well, that's not right. That's still the oyster soup. Okay, something's missing here, but that's all right. Here is a flan. I think these are out of sync, but that's okay. Anyway, this was our foray into the history of food and art and how we incorporated that into our book. So if you decide to get a copy, and I did bring a few copies today that are available for sale, along with some copies that you can, of a sell sheet you can take if you'd rather order it from Amazon or Barnes & Noble or some other source. That would be fine. But it really is a celebration of food, wine, art, and above all, the loving relationship that John and I have had for the past 60 years. Just remember, as Oscar Wilde so deliciously put it, living well is the best revenge. Okay, thank you very much.
would anybody like to add questions or comments? Special memories of delicious meals? Well, I could talk about one. The Sanssouci in Washington, D.C., where I had bouillabaisse for the first time. Oh, I love seafood. Bouillabaisse, marvelous. I went home, looked up Julia Childs, and created the same dish and invited my husband's brothers and their spouses. They didn't care for it. They didn't like it. My wonderful bouillabaisse. What? Some people, you just can't please them. Pushpa?
Hungry after seeing the pictures. That's why.
Ready for lunch.
There's a comment here, Phyllis and Mallory on the chat.
Oh. Valerie?
What does it say?
Wayne Thibault must have been a powerful early influence. What was he like?
Oh goodness, he was such a dear friend. For one thing, he was very funny. He had a grand sense of humor, and was very almost cavalier about his own standing in the art world, which was significant. But he had gone through quite a lot to get where he got. He told us about one of his first trips to New York to try to get a gallery, and he had visited like all of these galleries with his portfolio of some of his pie and cake paintings, and they all said, "Are you kidding me? Pies and cakes? Get out of here. You're not serious." So he went down the street, and he's so tired, he sat down and thought, okay, I might as well wrap it up and go home. And then somebody tapped him on the shoulder. And he looked around, and it turned out he was sitting in front of Alan Stone's gallery. And Alan saw him and came out and said, "What do you got?" And Wayne said, "Nothing you'd be interested in." And Alan said, "Yeah, well, let's see it." So Wayne took his portfolio in, and they looked at it, and Alan Stone gave him a show. So it was his first big New York show of the pies and cakes that made him very famous. And one other story about that. Before he tried taking this pop art to New York, he had a show in Sacramento at a gallery called Artists Cooperative Gallery that he was one of the co-op members. It's sort of like GFAA. And he had this show of pies and cakes. And John and I tried to be, really supportive. We wanted to say, "Yeah, Wayne, this is great. We love your pies and cakes." And so we went to the show, and we looked at the prices, these paintings, $250. And we said, "Oh man, we can't afford that. Maybe we should have, scraped something together, Boy, do I wish we had scraped something together, because these days, those paintings go for well over 2.5 million. So we really blew it.
I just want to say this was so delightful, and many of us here moved to Okamak and celebrate the fact that we don't need to cook anymore. We gave away all our cookbooks, and I'm about to buy a cookbook.
Well, the nice thing about this cookbook is that it's not just a cookbook. There's lots of art and lots of stories. So,
do you have a favorite restaurant on earth that you like so well?
oh, what a good question. What a hard question. I have to say that one of my very, very top favorites, I have no idea if it's any longer in business, but when John and I left Santa Barbara, we moved to Mexico. And we ended up in Colonial Polanco in Mexico City. And we decided that we wanted to try some of the restaurants. And there was this restaurant called La Lorraine, 125 San Luis Potosi. And it was run by a French woman from Alsace-Lorraine. And she even brought things in from France because she didn't think Mexican food was as good as it should be. So she imported her raspberries and her this and that, her salmon and so on. And she cooked wonderful food. We closed the joint many times. And at the end of the evening, Madame was always sitting in the back of the room counting up her receipts. And across the table from her sat her gray poodle with a white napkin around its neck, enjoying a bowl of onion soup. So that really still is one of my favorite restaurants because of the whole story of it.
On the Andy Warhol, it's interesting how many varieties of the soups he has pictured are no longer available, showing how much our food tastes have changed in the United States.
That's the 1960s. Yeah, we still eat Campbell's soup, but maybe not the same kinds.
Just a minute, please, one on the back.
A lot of the emphasis you had was on the French cooking and European kind of tastes. I remember being in Hong Kong and walking through the market, and about 95% of the things that were for sale there and displayed, I had no idea what they were. And so my question is, whether you explored some of the Asian art in relation to food and the differences from what you were used to or what you presented in your book.
I didn't put a lot of emphasis on Asian cuisine, although I certainly have studied it. In fact, one of the other first dinners that I cooked for my parents was teriyaki, because I loved all things Japanese, so I was really experimenting with that. And we didn't include a lot of Asian art in the book, or art from other cultures in the photographs. That's a good point, and it would be fun to explore that more specifically if we do a follow-up.
Your husband's wonderful illustrations are great, but they're hard to endure for someone who's fasting today.
Well, that is definitely your loss. Sorry about that. Well, let's see. If you want to take one of the calendars, you can enjoy it once you've gone off your fast, or maybe one of the books. Okay, all right.
Well, there's no French restaurant in Gainesville.
Oh, there is now. Alpine. Have you heard about Alpine? It's a little bistro that supposedly has croque monsieur. I've been wanting to go. It just opened about, 6 months ago, something like that?
Sure. That's a sandwich.
Yeah, well, yeah. It doesn't really have cuisine. You're right, Phyllis. And there is one in Ocala, though. Is it back open now? Can't remember the name of it. Chateau. Anyway. No, it wasn't Chateau Ocala. It had a little bit different name from that.
I was just reading yesterday that the French, particularly in Paris, are smitten with American food. They want the big breakfast. They want the hamburgers. They're into really like the fast food love. That's what they're craving right now. Crazy.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
So
Yeah.
pretty soon they'll be fat like Americans.
We were in Lyon, France, in the most famous restaurant, and we had a beautiful banquet there. And, what was I going to say? Anyway, the banquet was outstanding, and the waiters came down with Alaskan baked ice cream. What do you call that again?
Right, baked Alaska.
They had
yeah.
candles on it, and they came down the stairs.
Oh, lovely.
So gorgeous, but apparently it was also a restaurant during the war, there was some special art, all carved. It was an organ and all the French carving, the little people around it. It was wonderful. But they had to cover that up so the Germans wouldn't grab it and mess it up.
Right.
And they managed to save it.
Oh, that's wonderful.
But the other thing was, I went to cooking school in Lyon, and there the chef of that particular restaurant was one of the top chefs of France, and he sent his son to school in the United States, cooking school.
Oops.
But the other interesting thing was that a chef, he had a big fillet of salmon, and he opened the oven door. The oven was warm, and then he put the salmon in front, and he put a pound of butter on top. And that supposedly was supposed to take the fishy smell out or change the.
Oh,
I don't quite remember all of that, but
interesting.
it was
Okay.
interesting.
Yeah, that is
Anyway,
intriguing.
were interesting times.
Yeah. We had a wonderful time in France. John, a few years back, actually it was July of 2001, and he had two paintings in a show at the, let's see, what is it? The Museum of Contemporary Art in Nice. And so we thought, well, we had to go for the opening, right? I mean, we wouldn't want to miss the opening. So we decided to spend 3 weeks in France and flew into Nice for the opening and all the festivities and stayed in the hotel that Matisse had always stayed in when he was in town. And I think we had the same room because there's a beautiful painting by Matisse of this room with a balcony with these shutters on both sides. And that's exactly when we walked into the room, I was like, oh my God, it's Matisse's room. And then we had, for a week, we spent having our dinners on the balcony because we could go out all over town and buy the most wonderful stuff, wines and cheeses and meats and breads and so on, and have our own little, party on the balcony and watch the cruise ships sailing in and out. And the neat thing too, at all the shops, the second time I went in, everybody, said, "Oh, Monsieur, Madame O'Connor, welcome back," and so it's like, wow, they know me. So we had a great time. And then we went to Paris and took the high-speed train up to Paris and had other marvelous adventures and good food there. So, okay.
Well, thank you very, very much. We're over our hour.
Yes. And
any final comments, questions? No?
if any of you are
Yeah.
interested in the cookbook, we do have copies back there, or you can take a sell sheet and order it, or you can let me know and I'll be happy to, sell you a copy. It's cheaper if you buy it from me.